All right, so let's dive into this case, the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. I mean, this case, it really shook the nation, right? And we're going deeper this time, way beyond just the headlines that you probably remember.
Yeah.
We're going deep into the government's brief from the federal trial. And this brief, it's not just about those murder convictions.
Right.
This thing dives into hate crime charges.
Yes.
And even attempted kidnapping.
Yeah, a whole other level.
It adds a whole new level of complexity to this whole thing.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion here, and revealing the true motivations behind it all.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting here is how the feds went after elements that the state trial didn't even touch.
Right. Okay, so let's set the scene here. February 23rd, 2020.
Okay.
Sunday afternoon in Satilla Shores. It's a neighborhood in Brunswick, Georgia. Ahmaud Arbery's out for a jog. Something he did, pretty much daily.
Yeah, almost daily. Now, keep in mind, Ahmaud didn't actually live in Satilla Shores. He often ran through there, though sometimes stopping by a house that was under construction.
Okay.
This detail is going to be important because it becomes a focal point in the case.
Yeah, I mean, the house was basically wide open, right? No doors, no interior walls. I don't even think there was a keep out sign or anything.
Right.
And we know from surveillance footage that he didn't take anything.
Yeah.
Didn't vandalize, no crime whatsoever.
No, but two neighbors, they found him suspicious.
Right.
And one of them, he called the police. Non-emergency line.
Yeah.
Simple as that. Now, he was armed, but never even drew his weapon, just kind of observed the situation.
Okay.
But the other neighbor, Gregory McMichael, he reacted very differently.
Oh, boy. Here we go.
This is where things take a dark turn.
Okay.
Gregory calls his son, Travis. He grabs his .357 Magnum revolver. Travis grabs his Remington shotgun. And they hop in Travis's pickup truck.
Oh, man.
And this detail is chilling.
Right.
It had a Confederate flag vanity plate, and they take off after Ahmaud.
Wow. Think about that for a second. A father and son, armed with powerful guns, chasing a young man who's just jogging. I mean, it's already tense, but then it gets worse because a third person enters the picture. William Bryan.
Yeah.
He sees what's happening, and he decides to join the pursuit.
Yeah.
In his own pickup truck.
In his own truck.
And William Bryan, he didn't even know the McMichaels.
Didn't know them.
He'd never even seen Ahmaud before.
Right.
But he just assumed, based on nothing more than seeing a black man being chased by two white men, that Ahmaud must have done something wrong.
He even told the police later that he thought Ahmaud might have shot somebody.
Wow.
This just shows you the assumptions and the biases at play here.
It's just this narrative of presumed guilt based on nothing but prejudice. It ultimately leads to this deadly confrontation. So as the chase continues, Bryan even tries to cut Ahmaud off with his truck, actually hitting him at one point. They trap him. And it's Gregory McMichael who describes him as trapped like a rat.
Trapped like a rat.
Boasting that he wasn't getting away.
Imagine the terror that Ahmaud must felt. Surrounded by two trucks, two armed men yelling at him, Gregory screaming, "Stop, or I'll blow your finding head off." He was boxed in.
Yeah.
Nowhere to go.
And remember, unarmed, nothing on him.
Nothing.
Not even a wallet or a phone.
He tries to kind of dodge around Travis's truck.
Yeah.
But Travis moves toward him, shotgun aimed.
Right.
And Ahmaud, in a desperate attempt to defend himself, tries to grab the gun.
Yeah.
That's when Travis fires. 3 shots, hitting and critically wounding Ahmaud.
Oh, man.
And even though he's still alive at this point, none of the 3 men did anything to help him.
Jeez. So Ahmaud collapses, bleeds out, dies right there on the street. Gregory McMichael later told police the only time he touched Ahmaud after he fell was to check if he had a weapon.
Wow.
Which, of course, he didn't.
He did.
This is where the case takes an even darker turn. The brief, as we go deeper, reveals this pattern of racial bias that the prosecution presented as central to the case. It wasn't just murder. They were arguing. This was a racially motivated killing, a hate crime.
Exactly. And they didn't hold back. They dug into the defendant's past. They pulled out social media posts, text messages, witness testimonies, and what they found was disturbing.
Give us some examples. What kind of things were they posting and saying?
Well, for instance, there were text messages where Travis McMichael used horrific racial slurs when describing black people. He would casually call them criminals.
Wow.
Praised racist memes. And he even said things like, "I'd kill that feffing N-word," after watching a video of a black man playing a prank on a white man.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
What about Gregory McMichael and William Bryan? Were they any different?
Sadly, no. Gregory McMichael was documented making really derogatory comments about Black people.
Like what?
Including one where he said he wished they would all die. He also had online posts supporting vigilantism.
Yeah.
Which ties into this whole idea of them taking the law into their own hands.
So it wasn't just casual racism. It was a belief system.
It was a justification for violence.
Yeah?
And as for William Bryan, he had a history of using racial slurs in text messages. He was furious when his daughter started dating a Black man. He would automatically assume that a Black person was a criminal based on nothing more than what type of crime was committed.
So we're starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
It's not just about what happened on that day,
Right.
but a history of racial prejudice.
That may have influenced their actions, yeah.
Yeah. And the prosecution also brought up instances where the McMichaels treated white people completely differently. There's testimony from a white neighbor who frequently jogged past their house, someone they didn't even know.
Right.
They never stopped him, never questioned him, never even gave him a second glance.
Yeah, like they had this internal rule book about who belongs in their neighborhood and who doesn't.
Right.
And that rule book was heavily influenced by race.
Yeah. But how did the defense respond to all this? I mean, they couldn't just ignore it.
Well, Gregory McMichael and William Bryan both claimed that their actions were based on suspicion of criminal activity, not on Ahmaud's race. Gregory said he recognized Ahmaud from the surveillance video at the construction site.
Okay.
Even though we know that that video showed Ahmaud doing nothing wrong.
So they were trying to argue that they would have gone after anyone they suspected of a crime, regardless of race. That seems pretty hard to believe, though.
Yeah, that's where the prosecution countered with a key legal argument.
Okay.
The concept of but-for causation.
Okay, now legal jargon always kind of makes my head spin.
Sure.
Can you break down but-for causation for us?
Think of it like this. But-for causation means that the crime wouldn't have happened but for a specific factor. In this case, the prosecution was arguing that even if the defendants were partly motivated by suspicion of criminal activity, the events wouldn't have unfolded the way they did but for Ahmaud being Black and being on those public streets.
So even if there were other factors involved, if race and his presence in that neighborhood were key motivators, then it still meets the criteria for a hate crime.
Precisely. It doesn't have to be the sole motivation, just a crucial part of that chain of events that led to the crime.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
They were trying to show a pattern of behavior that was consistent with racial bias, which the jury could then use to determine if Ahmaud's race was a but-for cause in his death. And obviously that raises the question of how they proved that.
Well, they had a two-pronged approach. They used direct evidence, like those text messages and social media posts.
Right.
But they also relied heavily on circumstantial evidence.
Like what?
Well, things like how they treated that white jogger compared to how they treated Ahmaud. It was about painting a complete picture of their mindset and motivations.
And the jury ultimately found that Ahmaud's race was a but-for cause.
Yes.
Which means they believed that he was targeted, at least in part because he was Black.
That's a huge win for the prosecution because it establishes a foundation for the hate crime charges. But remember, there's another layer to this case.
Right.
The attempted kidnapping charges.
Yeah, let's unpack those.
Yeah.
Because I have to admit, I'm a little fuzzy on how attempted kidnapping even comes into play.
To understand that, we have to dive into the specific language of federal law to get a conviction for attempted kidnapping. The prosecution had to prove three key things.
Okay.
First, that the defendants tried to unlawfully seize or confine Ahmaud.
Okay.
Second, that they did so to obtain some kind of benefit.
Right.
And third, that they used what's called an instrumentality of interstate commerce to commit the crime.
Oh, hold on. What kind of benefit are we talking about here?
Yeah.
And what does interstate commerce have to do with anything? This all happened within one neighborhood in Georgia.
Those are great questions.
Yeah.
And they really get to the heart of the legal complexities of this case.
All right. I'm all ears. Let's dig into those attempted kidnapping charges.
Let's start with that benefit thing you're asking about. The defense argued they were just trying to apprehend a suspect, Good Samaritan, civic duty, but the prosecution argued for something much darker.
Yeah, I mean, Good Samaritan doesn't really fit with that Confederate flag vanity plate.
Yeah.
What was the prosecution's take on this benefit thing?
They went all in on the idea that the McMichaels, and to a lesser extent, Brian, got a sort of twisted satisfaction from acting as vigilantes, controlling a black man they saw as a threat. That feeling of power,
right,
fueled by prejudice.
Yeah.
That was their benefit.
And they backed that up with all those text messages and social media posts. Right.
Exactly.
It wasn't just the language, it was the mindset.
The mindset that it revealed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Remember Travis McMichael's messages about wanting to make an example out of someone? His violent reactions to those videos?
Yeah.
Those weren't just words.
Right.
They were glimpses into his worldview, a worldview that led to Ahmaud's death.
It's like they were itching for a confrontation.
Yeah.
And Ahmaud, just by being a black man in their neighborhood, became the target.
Yeah.
But what about that interstate commerce thing?
Okay.
That still seems like a stretch.
Right.
How did they convince the jury that these trucks just driving around one neighborhood had anything to do with interstate commerce?
This is where it gets interesting because it makes us think about federal law in a wider context. The prosecution basically argued that those trucks, simply by being manufactured outside of Georgia and then brought into the state, qualified as instruments of interstate commerce no matter what.
Okay.
No matter what they were doing.
Interesting.
At any given moment.
Okay.
It's about their connection to this larger system.
So it's not about those specific trucks crossing state lines during the chase. It's about them being part of this web of commerce that goes across the entire country.
Exactly. And the prosecution had decades of legal precedent on their side. Think about it. Cars, phones, even guns have all been used in federal crimes.
Yeah.
And courts have consistently ruled that origin outside the state where the crime occurred makes them instruments of interstate commerce. It's powerful.
Yeah. So even though the defense tried to argue for a much narrower interpretation, focusing on what those trucks were doing at that moment, the prosecution's view won.
Yes. And that's key because it locked in that attempted kidnapping charge. But this case, it goes beyond just legal stuff.
Right.
It makes us confront racial bias, vigilantism, and a justice system that sometimes struggles to deliver true equality.
Yeah, there's a bigger picture here, isn't there? It's about Ahmaud, of course.
Of course.
But also about countless others who have been targeted and profiled because of the color of their skin.
This case sparked a national conversation. Yeah. That racial prejudice is still deeply embedded in our society, and that we have a long way to go.
Okay, so we've covered the hate crime charges.
Yeah.
The attempted kidnapping charges. The evidence of racial bias.
Yes.
And the defense's attempts to explain it all away. What else does this brief highlight?
Well, there's a fascinating legal debate about the nature of the streets in Satilla Shores.
Okay.
Were they public or private?
Right.
This little detail plays a surprisingly big role in the hate crime charges.
Wait, how can that affect a hate crime charge?
It goes back to that element of the hate crime law we talked about, that the victim must have been engaging in a federally protected activity.
Right.
The prosecution argued that Ahmaud, using those public streets, was that protected activity.
Ah, I see. So if the streets were private,
right,
that element wouldn't apply.
Right.
And the whole case could fall apart.
Exactly. The prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that those streets were public.
So how did they do that?
Well, they argued that even though there was no formal paperwork officially handing ownership over to the county, those streets were treated as public roads in every way that mattered. They presented evidence that Glynn County had been maintaining those streets for years, responding to residents' requests, even budgeting for paving.
So they were basically saying, look, it might not be on paper, but the county's been acting like these streets are public for years, so they should be legally considered as such.
Right.
Did the defense just accept that?
Not at all.
Okay.
They argued that just doing maintenance work didn't make them public.
Right.
They pointed out that Satilla Shores was a planned community.
Yeah.
And sometimes these types of communities, they maintain their own roads.
Okay.
For a while, even if they eventually become public later on.
So how did the court handle this?
The judge carefully weighed the evidence.
Yeah.
Ultimately sided with the prosecution.
Okay.
He ruled that the county's long history of maintaining those streets, combined with the fact that they were listed on a county document as public roads, was enough to consider them public for the hate crime charge.
Wow. That's a pretty big ruling. It seems like it could affect other cases.
You're right.
Where that's in dispute.
It sets a precedent. It highlights the fact that judges often have to look beyond just the letter of the law and consider the spirit of the law, the intent. In this case, the judge recognized that the intent of the hate crime law was to prevent racial discrimination in public life. And he wasn't going to let a technicality about property ownership undermine that. Yeah.
It's like he was saying, we're not going to let these guys get away with a hate crime just because there's some question about who owns the pavement.
Exactly. He was looking at the big picture. And this brings up a fascinating point about hate crime laws in general, you know?
Yeah.
They aren't always simple. Proving racial motivation beyond a reasonable doubt can be really hard.
Yeah.
And it often involves piecing together a complex puzzle.
So how did the prosecution in this case go about building that puzzle?
Well, they used this multi-layered approach. They wove together direct evidence, like those text messages, with circumstantial evidence, like how they treated Ahmaud compared to how they treated white people.
Right.
It was about painting that picture of their mindset and their biases.
And it makes you wonder how many other hate crimes go unpunished or even unrecognized.
Because the evidence isn't as clear.
Right.
Or the perpetrators are more careful.
Yeah.
That's a sobering thought. It speaks to the limitations of the legal system.
So we've covered a lot here.
We have.
The chase, the killing, the evidence of racial bias, the arguments around the hate crime and attempted kidnapping charges.
Right.
And even this debate about the streets.
Yeah, it's been a deep dive for sure. I think it's good to pause here for a minute.
Yeah.
Let it all sink in.
Yeah.
Before we get to the final part of our analysis.
You're right. This case is a stark reminder that racial prejudice is still a powerful force.
Yeah.
And that we all have a responsibility to confront it and challenge it and work towards a more just world. Okay, so we've been going over this case really carefully, but there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet. Travis McMichael. He actually tried some pretty interesting legal tactics to get certain evidence tossed out.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even in a case with such strong evidence of racial bias, the defense still tried to use legal technicalities to their advantage.
So what kind of evidence was he trying to suppress?
Well, two things mainly. First, there was that Facebook post, remember, from the Satilla Shores neighborhood group where they were talking about possibly privatizing their streets.
Right, right. And proving those streets were public, that was crucial for that hate crime charge.
Exactly. Because if those streets weren't public, then Ahmaud wasn't exercising a federally protected right when he was jogging, which means a key element of the hate crime law wouldn't apply. So McMichael argued that this Facebook post was just a bunch of opinions from residents on a legal matter and that it shouldn't be allowed as evidence. It was a pretty smart move, really, to try to cast doubt on that whole public street argument.
So did it work? Did the court throw out the Facebook post?
No. The judge saw right through it. He ruled that the Facebook post was circumstantial evidence. It just added to the whole picture of the streets, but it wasn't a decisive legal statement.
So even though the post wasn't directly about what happened to Ahmaud, it gave some context to that whole debate about the streets.
Yeah, and the judge made an important point. The jury already had a ton of other evidence to consider, right?
Right.
The testimony from the county official, those county documents with the maintenance records, they had plenty to work with, even without that Facebook post.
Okay, that makes sense. What was the other evidence McMichael tried to challenge?
This one's a little technical. It was about 2 records that showed where his truck and Brian's truck were manufactured. Remember, those trucks were key to the attempted kidnapping charge because the prosecution had to prove they were instrumentalities of interstate commerce.
Right, and since both trucks were almost certainly made outside of Georgia, those records would help show that.
Exactly. But McMichael's lawyers, they noticed a typo on the affidavits that were used to authenticate those records.
Okay.
The dates on the affidavits were actually 5 days in the future. Seems like someone needed a better proofreader.
Wait, what? How does that even happen?
It was just a clerical error, a classic one.
Right.
But McMichael's team tried to use it. They argued that the records should be thrown out completely because of those flawed affidavits.
So basically they were saying, throw the baby out with the bathwater because of a paperwork mistake. Did that work?
No, not at all. The judge said the typo was just an obvious mistake. A scrivener's error, they call it. Didn't affect the records themselves.
Common sense wins.
And the judge also pointed out that even without those specific records, the jury had plenty of other evidence to conclude those trucks were instruments of interstate commerce.
Because, like we said before, vehicles are usually considered part of interstate commerce.
Exactly.
Even if they aren't crossing state lines at the exact time of a crime. So McMichael's attempt to use that technicality didn't really hurt the prosecution's case.
Yeah, it's fascinating, though. Even in a case like this, the defense still tries to use these little procedural moves to create doubt.
Right.
To shift the focus.
To get people looking away from the big picture.
Exactly.
But in this case, those moves didn't change anything.
Nope.
The evidence was just too strong. The jury found the defendants guilty on both the hate crime and attempted kidnapping charges.
That's a key takeaway from all this, I think. This case shows us that hate crime laws can be used to hold people accountable, not just for their actions, but for the beliefs behind those actions. It's about recognizing that racial bias can actually drive criminal behavior, and that it needs to be punished.
So as we're wrapping up, what are the key takeaways? What makes this case so important, beyond the loss of Ahmaud Arbery's life?
Well, it's a stark reminder that racial prejudice is a problem in our society.
Yeah.
This wasn't random. It was a deliberate attack.
It forced us to look at vigilantism, too.
Yeah.
The idea that people can just decide to enforce the law however they want.
Based on their own prejudices, yeah.
It's a scary thought.
It is. And this case, it showed us just how dangerous that mindset is.
This case, it wasn't just about Ahmaud Arbery. It was about a system that allowed this to happen. A system that too often fails to protect people from racial violence.
And it's a reminder that we all have to do our part to change that system, to fight against prejudice, and to work towards a future where everyone can live with dignity and safety and equality.
Well said. This has been a tough conversation, but an important one.
Yeah.
And we hope it encourages you to keep learning about these issues and to join the fight for justice and equality. Ahmaud Arbery's life mattered. His story matters.
It does.
And we have to remember what we've learned.
We have to.
Thanks for joining us.